good. There's only some cash game played yesterday, so nothing really to go over. Let's just jump into the next section here. This is in the masterclass on flop strategy when facing a bet, going through different examples. So it's a long section. Let's just get it broken down. Camera.
Now let's discuss how to play as the pre-flop caller out of position. This is going to be a pretty difficult spot that you're often going to be in when someone raises and you call from the blinds. So understand that when you call from the big blind, you will never have the range advantage. And since you don't have the range advantage, you should never lead. A lead is a leading post-flop bet made into the pre-flop raiser from out of position. And this is a bad play. You do not want to lead. I know some people think you should be leading with polarized range, which is what you should be leading with if you're going to have a leading range. But you just should not have a leading range. You don't need to do it. There's no point in doing it. So you should check. Now, you don't necessarily want to check in the dark and let your opponent know that you're going to check every single time. But you should check from out of position because you never have the range advantage. And if you do have the range advantage, it's very minimal, like 51%, right? So just check every time and your life's going to be way easier. Now, if you check and your opponent checks behind, we go directly to the turn. But we're not going to discuss that right now. First, we're going to discuss when you are facing a bet. So someone raises, you call from out of position, the big blind, or the small blind, and the flop comes, you check, and they make a bet. Let's discuss minimum defense frequency. We discussed this pre-flop. Let's discuss it again. So minimum defense frequency is 1 minus the bet you're facing divided by the bet plus the pot. And you're going to find that you should be defending wider when you face small bets, and you should be defending tighter when you're facing large bets, which makes sense, right? When you're facing a smaller bet size, you're getting better pot odds. When you're getting better pot odds, you should defend with a wider range. When you're facing a giant bet, you should defend tighter because you're not getting very good pot odds. All right? However, this is a very, very important point. The minimum defense frequency does not strictly...
Is this humorous to you? You guys can't even see him because if there he is, you can kind of see him. Sitting on my shoulder.
Because of how he's been looking at me while he's doing it.
Yeah. There you go.
I felt like I was watching one of, those, like, from, like, the Asian, like, joke shows, where the prankster shows or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And it just keeps going, and all you hear is the laugh track.
Right.
I felt like I was the laugh track.
That was pretty much what was going on over here, yeah.
He looks so uncomfortable.
But he's very happy.
I don't...
He might not be physically comfortable, but he's happy with it.
I mean, he's yawning. Paws are hanging over.
He's a happy boy.
Weird ass.
Just gotta... Hopefully he stays settled and just keep going with this.
Apply on the flop because you're going to be out of position in this scenario and you're not going to be able to realize your equity well at all. What I mean by that is, say you flop king high on a ace 6-3 board. You could have the best hand, and if we were all in at this point for, let's say, a 30% pot bet, you should call because you're probably going to win, well, 1/5 of the time, right? However, you're going to have a difficult time realizing your equity when you're out of position, meaning you're going to check call the flop with king high, your opponent's going to bet the turn, and you're just going to have to fold basically every time, right? So you're going to have a very, very difficult time getting to the showdown and realizing your equity. Because of that, you should fold substantially more than you should if you were strictly adhering to minimum defense frequency. So do not think you need to strictly adhere to it. It is important to note, though, that every hand in your defending range that's going to be check calling needs to realize its required equity based on your pot odds. So if your opponent bets, let's say they bet half pot, you know that you need to realize 25% equity in this scenario because you have to call 0.5 pot size bets to win a total of 2 pot size bets. That's 25%. So you need to make sure every hand that you're going to call with realizes 25% equity or more. And that very often will leave you under defending. All right, let's discuss this common scenario where you check out of position, your opponent bets, and it's folded to you. We need a way to generalize these situations, and there are 4 main factors that are going to impact your play. We have hand type, nut advantage, stack depth, and position. So let's go through each one of these. Hand type. You already know the hand types. You can have a premium made hand or draw, or marginal made hand or junk. With your junk, this is usually going to be most of your unpaired hands that don't have any reasonable draw. Just fold. It's that easy. Don't get out of line. Don't think you have to be running insane check raises with no hand, no draw. Just fold. With your marginal made hands, these hands are very often going to call because they want to keep the pot manageable, right? These are your top pair bad kickers, middle pair.
You guys can't see what's going on, but there's major things happening with Chuchi right now. Does it see him coming up in the camera? Yeah, I'll make it bigger. I can see. Chuchi, are you there? Ghost dog. There I am. I'm haunting you. Woo. So what are we doing? I'm gonna go back over here into the nether world.
I just know we were about to have a oops dog fell, and I'm like, there's so. Oh Lord, he's trying to lay down on your shoulder.
This is so convenient, sir. This is the ideal situation you want for studying high-level poker. This is.
Look.
Hit play. I'm watching. Jonathan Little's fascinating. Well, whatever. See this in the camera?
Yeah, I've been watching it.
All right. Well, I guess we'll do this. Where are you going now? I can't balance. Okay. This is not the Chuchi. Hello, everybody. Discussing hand ranges with Chuchi. The first thing you want to be aware of is there bacon in your hand? If there is, you have the range advantage. If not, you should check your other hand to see if there's bacon in it. If there isn't, well, maybe you can get a nut advantage if you have some nuts. Like almonds. Your marginal made hands are things that have margarine on them. Like English muffins. The fuck is wrong with you? The look on Sergeant's face. This is not helpful, sir.
He's so comfortable.
Look, it's like it's just his head. Look, it's like I'm not even here. Okay. It's like a weird anime character who always has his dog on his shoulder.
He's so crazy. He is just chilling too.
Can we? If you'd stop licking my face, you could sit there. You're messing me up. Okay. Are we done? All right. This is enough. Okay.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Oh,
There's no way to gracefully do that. Go lay down somewhere. Jesus. Ah.
Handshake down off you?
Yeah. Get back to this now.
Yeah, it's one of the best strategies.
I'm ignoring him.
Okay, he'll go to it.
All right. Let's get back to this.
Pairs, bottom pairs, sometimes ace high, sometimes king high. You're going to want to check and then call a bet with those hands. With your premium made hands and your draws, though, you're going to either want to call or raise depending on the scenario and these other 3 factors, and we're going to get to that in just a second. All right, when you have the nut advantage, when you have a premium made hand or draw, you typically want to check raise whenever your opponent bets, and that's because you have far more nut hands in your range than your opponent. If we think back to a flop like Jack 6-6, right? That's a scenario where if you check out of position and your opponent bets, you should be check raising very frequently because you have a whole lot of 6s in your range, right? But let's say the board comes Ace King 10. That's a board you should check raise on very, very infrequently because you don't have a nut advantage at all. So with your best hands on Ace King Jack, you should actually check call because on average your range is going to be behind your opponent, and they have a big nut advantage, even though you happen to have the nuts this one rare time, and therefore you should be check calling. When we are raising, by the way, when we are in position, which is not the current case, but if we're in position, we're going to be raising to about 2.5 times our opponent's bet, and when we're out of position, you're usually going to be raising to about 3 times your opponent's bet. That said, as your opponent bets bigger, you can typically size it down a little bit, and as your opponent bets smaller, you should typically size it up a little bit. For example, let's say your opponent raises to 3 big blinds pre-flop, you call. On the flop, you check, they bet 1 big blind. Well, it'd be silly to raise to 3 big blinds over a 1 big blind bet, because then your opponent has to put in 2 big blinds to try to win a 13 big blind pot, which is clearly amazing pot odds for them. However, if they bet 7 big blinds into the 7 big blind pot, you don't need to raise to the full 21 big blinds, because if you just raise to like 17 big blinds, you're already kind of putting them in a difficult spot, and stacks are already starting to be at risk.
It's as the stack to pot ratio decreases that the bets can go down. So the idea is like, the simple example is at 100 big blinds, somebody raises to 3, you call it in the big blinds, so there's 7 in the middle with the blinds and antes, or with the small blind and ante, and player betting a standard C bet of 1/3 pot being about 2, 2 1/4 blinds. You know, if you're going to check raise, you're going to want to go, you know, like you said, about 3 times and change. I'd probably go to 7, maybe a little bit more, depending on how vulnerable my hand was. And but the typical standard would be 7. And at that point, if the player calls, there'll be 21 blinds in the pot with 80 behind. So there'd be a 4-to-1 stack to pot ratio. In that same scenario, if you don't make that big enough raise, if he only bets 2 and you make it 5, then that puts 17 in the pot. It's almost a 5-to-1 stack to pot ratio. So this is how geometric betting works, where you can increase the size of the pot in relation to the stacks very quickly, so that after that call happens on the flop, the turn bet when you lead out going to be somewhere into a 21 big blind pot, somewhere around 17, maybe more. That's going to let the player know that you're absolutely going with it, because if they were to call with it, there would then be 50 blinds in the pot. You would only have about, 63 behind, so an all-in jam wouldn't be too unreasonable, because it would be just like 1.1 times the pot. Whereas if you bet smaller, then a all-in jam on the river of like 70 blinds is now like closer to 1.3, 1.5 times pot. So it's kind of less believable for value. So it's a good thing to remember, including the times you're check raising on the draw and you don't get there. That's how you can perpetuate that perfect bet sizing scenario, where players will make the mistake of calling on the turn, not realizing that they're committed to the pot technically if their hand has good showdown value, and then you get to jam on them on the river and make them fold all better hands. So being aware of stack to pot ratio is super big when you're in the big blind, because of this nut advantage, because you're going to be wanting to make the pot bigger in relation to the stacks when you're ahead.
So don't think there's some default bet size you must use in all scenarios. But when your opponent uses a normalish bet size, these sizing responses usually make sense. All right, stack depth. As always, when you are deeper stacked, you want to call more often with hands that realize their implied odds decently well. These are going to be backdoor draws and hands that could conceivably make the nuts, because when you do make the nuts, even though it's going to happen very infrequently, you're going to get paid off for a very, very large amount. And when you are raising, when you're deeper stacked, you want to be raising using a larger size in general, because you want to give your opponent poor odds in general, and also you want to raise bigger with your best hands because you want to be able to build the pot such that you can stack your opponent when you feel inclined to get all in by the river. And when you're shorter stacked, you can't call with the implied odds hands quite so much. Like say the flop comes Jack 7-3 and you have 8-6 with a backdoor flush draw. That's a hand where you probably should either call or raise when you're very deep stacked, but when you're shallow stacked, you should just fold immediately because you're going to have a tough time getting paid off. Well, when you get paid off for your full stack, it's not all that many chips, so it's not going to make up for all the times you lose when you fail to improve to a good.
Like when you only have 25 blinds in that scenario, it's not great to keep going. Probably shouldn't have defended in the first place because even if you get the full double, it's not going to happen often enough to mitigate the times that you didn't make the nuts, because you're going to be putting in about half your stack by the time you get to the river, and then you're kind of just in a really screwed scenario, whereas you would have been better off just folding to a flop bet, realizing that you didn't hit something really good and you could definitely be beat, and just letting it go, because what you're looking for with those kind of stacks is like making top pair and just getting it in. If you're beat too bad, you know. So it's a much different scenario if you have 10 jack there on that jack 8-4 board or whatever, jack 7-4 board or whatever he said. You know, it's a much different scenario when you have, you know, jack 10 and the player c-bets and then you check raise and they jam on you. You can actually still get it in and feeling like you're only slightly ahead with top pair because it's not worth that much. At 100 blinds, though, you're more likely to call the 8-6 because of the backdoor potential and because your hand is going to be so disguised. That's the real power of having the backdoor draws, is that when they hit, they're very hard to see for everybody. And a lot of players don't continue unless they get that perfect turn card. So they're not thinking of the concept where you started with a, you know, on the jack 7-3 board with the backdoor flush draw, you started out and then picked up, you know, a part of your straight on the turn, you know, like picking up the 5 on the turn. Well, now you're open-ended. They may not see that anymore because it's easier to see flush cards and straight cards, but either one, either your flush card or one of the filling straight cards like a 5 or a 9, makes it so you can actually keep continuing. And then when they bet again, they have to wonder why you're calling and if you just have a better value hand. So then when the river hits and it's a 4 or whatever, and you've made your straight or whatever the combination was, and you lead out huge, it just looks like such utter bullshit to somebody with top pair that you're going to get paid off a lot more.
Hand. And when you are shallower stacked, you're going to want to raise smaller. That said, there is an exception where you may use an all-in raise, but we'll discuss that more when we are discussing shallow stacked play. Next, position. Position influences how you construct your hand ranges to begin with, but in this scenario, we know we're going to be out of position. You should be more inclined to raise as a general response when you're out of position compared to in position, due to having a difficult time playing your weak draws on the turn when you fail to improve. So if you do have that junky draw on the flop and you're out of position, you should very likely put in the raise immediately. But when you are in position, then you can call way more often, because if your opponent checks a turn, you then have the opportunity to bet and pick up the pot when they don't have anything.
Out of position essentially means because you don't see what the other player does first, you're going to be checking and raising a lot more than in position, because in position you're already going to have the perfect information of knowing what your opponent is going to do before you act. Out of position, you're going to be checking more because of your overall disadvantage, and then raising more after you've seen what your opponent bets, or if they check back. So if they check back flops, you can then lead way more turns. You can lead rivers and 2-barrel bluffs. You can also get in a situation where you can check raise draws and then see what their response is, if you want to barrel off and go for it, or if you want to just take a free card. A lot of times when you check raise a draw on the flop and the turn comes off a seemingly bad card for you because it's good for your opponent's range, like where you check raise some kind of flush draw and then a card queen or higher comes out on the turn on a jack high board, well, this is typically good for your opponent in this scenario, even though they've just continued with you. So when you check that turn, the opponent has to be afraid that you're going for a double check raise, which is super rare, but that card that's now seemingly good for them could seem like it minted your hand. You could seem like you have 2 pair now and you just really want to get some action. If you bet again, you're going to scare them away because of the overcard. So that's why you didn't bet. So somebody, when they hit when they have king queen or something like that, and they do hit the top pair on the turn, you're going to see a lot of checks back. So you can actually buy the river for a check raise on a draw on the flop, and when you check on the turn, seeing your opponent check back means that you're probably not in a good bluffing scenario, because if they're betting the turn, then they're actually telling you what they have, but when they're checking back, they're kind of in this nebulous area. And then when the river comes off and you miss your draw, you have to think about, are those good ones to bluff, or are you just now up against top pair and not going to get it done? So out of position, a lot more checking and a lot more raising. Sounds counterintuitive, but a lot less calling. In position, a lot more calling, because you already have the perfect information of what your opponent's going to do, because they already did it. And now you're just waiting, to respond to it.
So let's take a look at the bet response flow chart. All right, this is when we are facing a bet, okay? We are facing a bet in this scenario where we first ask, what is our hand type? Do we have junk? If so, just fold. If we have a marginal made hand, life's easy, just call. If we have a premium made hand or draw, though, we want to ask, do we have the nut advantage? If we do not, call. If we do, raise. And again, this is not going to result in you playing a perfectly GTO strategy, but it's going to result in you playing decently well. And that's going to work out very, very well for you on average.
Understand this part of having the nut advantage. This is like you're in the big blind. You have 7-8 of hearts. The flop comes off Jack 6-6 with 2 hearts. So you have a draw, right, to the hearts and the backdoor straight draw, couple backdoor straight draws, but you also now possess the nut advantage, meaning you can have way more sixes in your range than somebody raising from even an early position. Check raising these hands is actually way more beneficial, because it's more likely you're going to get the fold without having to make your hand, because of the fact that you can have way more sixes than, let's say, somebody who opened in the low jack or under the gun +1 or whatever. If they don't really have too many jacks, I mean, they have pocket jacks and ace jack, but without that, it's kind of hard for them to continue without like some crazy premium hand, aces, kings, queens. But even then, you don't love it. When a board comes out like that and the big blind check raises, everybody's first thought is, well, this guy has a lot more sixes than me here. Or more succinctly, the player's thought is, this guy has a 6. So sometimes people will just fold. And I've had players fold and show me pocket aces just because they don't know what to do from there. And I just always tell them, good fold. And it's a thing in live poker that I kind of made it a point to myself to count how many times somebody would fold and show me, and I had, they had me, just totally beat, and I needed to hit my hand, or, hit my draw to win, and they would fold and show me, and I would have already mucked, and they would, getting pushed the pot, and I would say, that's a good fold. And just being honest. And they would say, well, is it a good fold? I'm like, most of the time it's a great fold. And it would fuck with people, and it would happen over and over and over again. Nobody ever seemed to call me out on it, because it just seemed too genuine that they should be folding, because the truth is they should, because I do have the nut advantage. So
again, the goal is to not.
But if you, like, let's say you don't have the nut advantage, right? But you do have that draw. So the same hand, 7-8 of hearts, but now the flop comes out, ace of hearts, ace of hearts, queen of hearts, deuce of diamonds, right? So you do have a good draw in this scenario, because your opponent is very unlikely to have a higher flush draw when they've raised. They're more likely to have some of these big cards. So when you check and they bet, well, now you're just going to call, because you don't have the nut advantage, because the nut advantage on this is big cards, aces, kings, ace, king, sets, things like that. But you do have this draw that you don't want to give up. So that's a good one to check call. These aren't good ones to check raise. And this is the difference in semi-bluffing and pure bluffing, is that when you semi-bluff on this board with the ace, king, and deuce with your flush draw, you're getting action. You're never getting a fold right away. So technically you're not semi-bluffing. You're actually just building a pot, because the amount that you're going to get a fold is so small, it's ridiculous. That the player actually has to have nothing, and even a player with pocket queens with the queen of hearts in their hand can actually call you, because they have the backdoor nut flush draw. So In those scenarios, you don't want to get blown off your draw, so you're just going to check call, try to make your flush, and go from there. Check raising there would be stupid, because if somebody has ace king, they're like, well, this guy's obviously just got a draw, and they're just going to pound money into the pot, and then you're going to be like, well, shit, now I have to fold. So it's a good concept to remember out of position. Sometimes you're not going to be taking the most aggressive approach, because you're just going to be at such a nut disadvantage on certain boards, especially boards with high cards.
Directly copy the solver. The goal is to play an implementable strategy that is close enough that you'll be able to figure out for all scenarios that you encounter. Now, when you're out of position, let's discuss this really quick. Understand again that you should fold more than the minimum defense frequency. I cannot make that any more crystal clear. When you are out of position, you should be folding more often. And when you are going to continue, you should be more inclined to raise. And when you're in position, now you should be defending at somewhere near the minimum defense frequency, because you're going to be able to act after your opponent and make...
The reason why for this, which I don't think he breaks down here, is because you're defending less. The minimum defense frequency is determined by your value of the hand versus the bet you're facing versus what's in the pot. So by certain percentages, you can sit there, and that's why people, this is usually the thing people are referring to when they say pot odds. It's actually incorrect. What they're referring to is the minimum defense frequency, meaning when I have this hand and I'm facing this action and there's this much money in the pot, what is the minimum amount that I should be defending this hand with, or this hand range? That's what they're referring to as pot odds. The truth of the matter is, out of position, you've lost a major component of the game, which is bluffing profitably, because out of position you have to make stark big moves, and your bluffs just aren't going to work as much when the board favors the range of the initial raiser, just because of the simple fact they're going to have those hands that can catch your bluffs. So you're removing this part of it. So because of that, your defense frequency has to go down, because you don't have an escape hatch where you can pull the trigger and make somebody fold a hand, because they're likely to have too good of a hand in this scenario. Whereas out of position, you can defend at the minimum defense frequency, and actually a little bit more, for the same reason, because now you hold the advantage of taking away this person's hand strength because of their positional disadvantage. You actually can now add more bluffs in, because you know what their actions are, you know how to respond to them. So you lose a little out of position and you gain a little in position, so your minimum defense frequency will fluctuate because of that. Because of the amount you can convincingly bluff. And that's really the concept that he's trying to get across, and I don't think he spells it out here.
Good, fundamentally sound decisions. Because very often, your opponent's going to continuation bet the flop wide, you're going to call, on the turn they're going to check when they don't have anything, and you'll have the opportunity to bet and pick up the pot, which will happen, well, it just won't even happen when you're out of position, because say you do check call with a junky hand out of position, you check call flop, turn goes check check, now if you bet the river, your opponent just has an easy call with all their bluff catchers. Whereas if you are in position, you get to bet the turn and the river, and that's going to put your opponent in a pretty nasty spot. So
that check or that check call flop, check turn, check or betting river to bluff, that situation does come up much when the board has changed based on your range versus your opponent's. If your opponent flops top pair, but let's say it's not great, like a jack or something like that, and they have like king jack or queen jack or whatever, and they bet the flop and you called it, and then they check the turn, and on the turn a flush card came off, and on the, there was two flush cards on the flop and a flush card hit the turn. When the river comes off and it doesn't do anything to the board, that's one where you can then bluff out of position, representing the hand, the exact hand that your opponent is afraid of, the exact reason why he checked the turn, in case you made the flush. Now, usually these bets have to be a lot bigger, but I do find that they work pretty close to the expected value that they need to, about 70%, versus a player with not such a great hand. Problem is, when it's an ace-high flop, you're much more likely to get called because the hand is so much stronger. If they have a hand like ace-king, they're just not going to fold to one stab that you make on the river, so it's more got to be a value scenario at that point than it is a bluff.
Well, that's generally how you want to play when you are facing a bet. Now let's go through lots and lots of examples.
And those examples are going to get intense in a minute here. Which of the following statements is false regarding the minimum defense frequency when out of position? You should always defend at minimum defense frequency from the blinds. That's not true. You should defend hands that will realize required based on equity that bets in your opponent's size. No. You should generally defend with any pair, better made hand, and weak draws such as backdoor flushes and overcard. None of the above. Oh, wait a minute. You should generally defend with any pair, a better made hand, and weak draws such as backdoor flushes. Oh, yeah, you should. Okay, yeah, well, my first answer was right. You should always defend at the minimum defense frequency from the blinds. No, we just talked about how you defend less from the blinds. You should defend wider as you face larger bets because your opponent is more likely to be bluffing. No. That's not true. You have to defend tighter because you're risking more money. Yeah, that's risking more money to continue. Exactly. Your equity realization is higher in position. I would say that's true. Yeah, because you're last to act, so when it checks to you, you can just decide to check behind on the river and realize all your equity right there in a showdown. When in position, you should defend at or more than the minimum defense frequency. Well, this is true because you are in position. All right, we're going to mark that as complete. Move on to the first example. It's going to be intense. So, if there's ever a time to get a notepad, it's going into these. These are going to be the same examples from the last one, but now we're facing a bet, so it's going to be kind of more complicated.
Now let's go through a bunch of examples where you are the pre-flop caller facing a bet. And we're going to go through the same flops we went through earlier when you were the pre-flop aggressor. So let's take a look at Ace, Jack, 5. Under the gun +1 raises. You call from the big blind. Flop comes Ace, Jack, 5, 2 spades. You check. Under the gun +1 bets 67% pot, 2/3 pot. In this scenario, you have to defend very cautiously due to completely lacking the nut advantage and the range advantage. And remember,
Nut advantage meaning you don't have many aces, jacks, or 5s in great amount because you would have 3-bet those pre-flops. If you had ace king, you would have 3-bet. If you had, you can have some ace jacks for sure. But your ace 5s you can have, but you really can't. You can have sets of 5s, but you really can't have pocket aces, pocket jacks, or ace king or ace queen, and that would be where the nut advantage lies. So
you're out of position here. You do not have to defend anywhere near the minimum defense frequency, right? In this situation, minimum defense frequency is 0.67 divided by 0.67 plus 1.67. Let's get out the calculator. We'll figure this out together. It's actually 1 minus that number. So we have 0.67 divided by 1.67 equals minus 1 equals. Minimum defense frequency in this scenario is 60%. But notice here, I am actually recommending that you fold 57% of the time, which is substantially more than 60%, right? I'm only defending 40%. Let's go through and break down how we're going to play these hands, by the way. I have us raising with a few of the absolute best hands, really just sets and 2 pairs, and then all the low flush draws. You may ask, why raise the low flush draws but not the high flush draws? Really just for simplicity to some extent. I'm sure you could go about mixing these way better. We're going to see what the solver does in just a second to see how it goes about selecting which draws to raise. But I think we're going to see this is roughly what the solver does. I know I said earlier that you don't want to raise when you completely lack the nut advantage. But in this scenario, notice we don't actually completely lack the nut advantage. It's pretty bad. We don't have aces and jacks, but we do have ace jack, jack 5, ace 5, pocket 5s, right? And you may ask, like, why is ace 5 suited, not in our range? Because we elected to 3-bet with this hand as a pre-flop 3-bet given our pre-flop range charts earlier. If you use a slightly different strategy, let's say you called this hand and 3-bet ace 4 suited, then we have a few more nut hands here. Big takeaway here, though, is you don't need to defend anywhere near minimum defense frequency. Notice our draws still make up more than a 1-to-1 ratio here. We can have up to 2 draws to every 1 premium made hand as before. However, when you are at a spot where you have a big range and nut disadvantage, you should be more inclined to play a little bit cautiously with your draws because you're raising into a range that just should be good and should not fold. Therefore, you should not raise with quite as many draws. Also notice the draws I'm raising with here, some of these down here are very junky. We have 4-3 backdoor flush draw as well, so that's a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. I don't think it's mandatory that you raise this hand, but I certainly think it's a pretty strong play. Because when you do raise this hand, if you get re-raised, you can just easily fold, right? And if you do happen to get lucky on the turn and make a straight, no one's going to see it coming. If you didn't want to raise these hands, you want to just fold them, maybe you raise a few more of the weaker flush draws. So I think that would all be good and reasonable. Notice we're just calling all the middle pairs, calling the vast majority of top pairs, because you really don't want to be raising hands like ace 10 when you're raising into a player who could easily have ace king, ace queen, ace jack, right? So this is a spot. Let's take a look at this. I'm folding 57%. Let's see what the solver does. Solver actually folds even more than I do, 68% of the time. Take a look at this. Solver actually does use these low, junky gut shot with some backdoor draws to raise sometimes. Solver also picks bottom pair to raise.
They're junky flush draws, but good combo draws because of the gut shot and because of running, pair cards, But so I wouldn't classify those as junky draws, just junky flush draws. But the 4-3, the 4 deuce, I'm much more inclined to feel good about those if I get into a situation where I have to put all the money in on the flop than I am with, the 9-4 suited, you know what I'm saying? Because then it's just the bare flush draw running cards for the straight. So it's an interesting way that the solver classifies it here.
Raise sporadically, which is kind of neat to see. It's also neat to see solver actually folds bottom pair the majority of the time. Seems pretty nitty to me. Remember, the solver assumes the opponent plays perfectly, and a good opponent raising from under the gun +1 is going to be very inclined to barrel with the vast majority of their bluffs on the turn, which the solver correctly realizes they're not going to be able to realize their equity well if they're going to be getting barreled very frequently. So that's probably why solver is folding out bottom pair. I do not expect the vast majority of players to actually be barreling very often. Like, say your opponent does have king 10, and they raise under the gun +1, you call, flop comes ace jack 5, you check, they bet, you call. A lot of people are just never betting the turn in that scenario. And
which is exactly why you always hear me saying sometimes you just gotta bet twice, because I am a super big fan of betting on the flop and continuing on the turn. I'm constantly looking for reasons to barrel and to 3-barrel. And on a board like that, when I have king 10, that would be absolutely one of the scenarios, because I have so few ways to win the hand otherwise that if I'm going to see, like if I decided to c-bet that scenario, I would definitely go for a 3-barrel, because versus the big blind, I should have all the aces. He shouldn't. He should have all the spade draws. So if I had like the king 10 off, like he's saying, but with the king of spades in my hand, I'm probably just going to check this back on the flop after he checks, hoping for a queen or a king or a spade or some kind of improvement before I make another move when he checks again on the turn, or I call a bet on the turn. For me, that's not one. But in the instances where I felt the player was typically folding a lot to just a single c-bet, and I did c-bet, and the player did happen to call, it makes more sense for me to barrel off in that scenario, because they're going to have just draws. So as long as a spade doesn't come out, I'm cool. And again, if I have that king of spades, if the spade hits the turn, I can check back and try to make the nut flush.
And while king 10 may not necessarily be a bet, a hand like queen 10,
because they're not going to check call lead. That's just not going to happen.
definitely is. And if you aren't betting queen 10, or your opponent's not betting queen 10, that's going to allow you to continue wider on the flop with the idea that you're going to fold out those hands on the turn if your opponent continues betting, these bottom pair type hands. Notice the solver does raise every once in a while. Notice 9% of the time. I was raising 7% of the time, so that's close enough. Solver calls the vast majority of these hands. Notice solver actually folds out some stuff like king, queen immediately. Solver somehow folds out king, jack immediately. I mean, I don't know in what world you're folding out king, jack here. Solver proceeds very tightly, and let me tell you why. It's because we are at a big range and nut disadvantage, right? Look, we have 30% equity. When you have 30% equity, you should be folding a lot. Can't make that any more clear. All right, now let me show you how solver is playing the draws, just so that we see this. When the solver does have the spades, it seems like it is electing to raise the king high spades some portion of the time, and then a lot of the junkier spades as well. Interesting that it picks like queen high spades over like 9-6 of spades. Not especially sure why it's doing this. Solver does funny stuff. As you see, it's raising the lowest spades every time because these have gut shots to go with them, of course.
Right, and these become more premium to me, even more so than the king high flush draw, because of the way that we get paid off when we fill the gut shot. I think the reason I saw one video a while ago about how solvers react to things numerically. I think the reason why it's choosing, some of these junky draws over, things like the 9-8 suited, is because of the fact that these junky draws, while crap, they still have a 4, 3, or deuce, which can make running straight cards. Like you can see, all of them have a 4-3 or deuce in there. So it's electing to bet this pattern more likely than it is to bet things like 9-6 suited, because the 9-6 really, it can't make any straights at all. So it's more likely to check those than it is to bet them, because there are less escape hatches that come off running cards for you. That's just basically what this one solver video that I saw has, and it was like explaining the solver. I forget what it was called on YouTube. I'll look it up after this. If anybody wants to know, I'll tweet it. But it's on my other YouTube account, so I can't look at it right now. But I think that's really what's going on here, because like the 6-4 suited, like, you know, if a 3 or a deuce or a 7 pops off, you know, even an 8, we now pick up, you know, straight draws. So there's just way more escapes to this than, you know, hitting the flush by itself.
But you see, I was recommending something like that where you're raising the weaker spades, but solver picks some of the queen highs. As long as you were somewhere in the ballpark in this categorization, you're going to be pretty fine. Notice solver does raise king of spades with a queen every once in a while, king of spades with a jack every once in a while. Interesting strategy, right? But that's what it's doing. Now let's take a look at when the button raises and we call from the big blind. Okay, button raises, we call from the big blind, flop comes ace, jack, 5, and now the opponent's betting 33% pot, because that's what size they use most of the time in this scenario. So let's go through this again and categorize our range. And this is a neat spot because we have a complete lack of premium made hands, but we have a decent number of draws that would really like to raise. And importantly, our opponent's strategy is going to be much wider on the button than when we were against an under the gun +1 raiser. And on top of that, we're getting way better odds immediately. And this is a spot where we have to presume the opponent's betting with 100% of their range. But if they're betting 100% of our range, hands like ace 9 and ace 8, maybe even ace 7, become pretty good hands. Yes, you are raising into premium hands sometimes, but notice the hands we're also raising with are these jack 5 and ace jack, which are in great shape. We have lots of flushes or flush draws that can easily continue. And we have these bad gut shots that are raising as well. So I think this is reasonable. If you told me you wanted to call ace 9 every time, that's fine. But if you do, you have to call with more of your draws, because we're already starting to get a decent number of draws.
Understand hands like ace 10 and ace jack should be 3-bet pre-flop when the button opens and you're in the big blind. So that's why they're in white out here and you don't have them. If you were playing against a player who was super tight and had opened on the button and you were in the big blind, I could see not 3-betting the ace 10 or the ace jack and then just hitting this flop and going for the check raise, because they're going to have an ace to beat you. And when they do have an ace, if you have ace jack, you're going to crush them. And when you have ace 10, they're going to 4-bet you on the flop, or 3-bet you on the flop, and you're just going to be able to get away with it and save yourself some money. But it is a scenario where you can check call down with the, you know, ace 9, ace 10s, ace 8s, things like that.
Draws in this scenario. Again, remember, you don't have to defend at minimum defense frequency. I was folding out half the time. Solver folds out, well, half the time, right? Good to see. Interestingly enough, solver does raise the top pairs as well. It raises ace 10 if it has it. I don't think I had ace 10. So if I had ace 10, I would definitely raise it too. Solver randomly picks stuff like bottom pairs to raise, which is neat.
See, and it's funny because my dividing line in that scenario isn't ace 9, it's ace 10. But because of the fact that I'm not going to have ace 10 there a lot by just calling pre-flop, I'm going to have 3-bet it. It's not in the strategy post-flop. So I guess for me, the lesson is that I should be 3-betting that ace 10 every time. And if it's the rare scenario where I'm not, I should be check raising it every time on a favorable flop like this.
Neat. Notice here, though, solver does not fold out any pairs now whenever it gets raised. Remember before, the solver was against under the gun +1. So
it's because of the size of the bet.
Solver was folding out a lot of 5, well, almost all the 5s, and a lot of the jacks even. Whereas against the button and against a smaller bet size, you just can't fold out any of the pairs. All right. What about now when we're in position? Button against under the gun. Well, now, because we are in position, we should be defending way more often. Also, our range is just going to be generally stronger. So in this scenario, under the gun +1 raises, we're on the button, we call, flop comes ace jack 5, they bet 33% pot. Well, again, we should raise our best hands and our draws. It's kind of hard to come up with too many draws in this scenario. We actually get to use some random backdoor flush draws with the kings if we feel inclined. These low flush draws we can raise as well. Calling all middle pairs, calling most top pairs, calling king, queen, and king 10 and queen 10. You probably could get away with raising queen 10 if you felt inclined. I don't think it's mandatory, but I don't mind calling here. But you see here, I'm only folding out 25% of the time now. We could probably get away with adding in a few more draws in this scenario. So, sure, I think that's reasonable. That said, you're going to find that when you're in position, you do a lot of calling. When you're out of position, you do a lot of raising. So what am I doing? Or what's the solver doing? Solver raises ace-jack, pocket jacks if it has it, pocket fives every time. Solver also picks these like bottom pair type hands to raise some portion of the time. This is very, very hard to actually implement in the real world in my experience. Like, how do you know the 10, 15, 20% of the time you should be raising the bottom pair? It's tough to know, right? Notice here, king, queen sporadically bluffs, queen 10.
See, for me, stuff like that is player dependent. Like, if I know that there's a low frequency play, like the 6-5 suited should be, raising on this flop when led into being on the button, but when led into small. If I know that that's a low frequency play, but kind of on the table, it kind of depends on who I'm up against, right? So it's not GTO, it's more exploitative, meaning if the player c-bets 100%, there's a guy I've been playing on WSOP that you guys have seen that I've just called the Mr. Compulsive, because he just compulsively c-bets every flop for 3x, no matter what's in the pot, no matter how many players are there, no matter what his position. If it gets to him and he's the first to act post-flop, he is betting 3 blinds. That is all. Versus him, I am going to raise any and all equities, meaning any pair, any draw, anything, meaning queen 10 for me is getting raised here every time, because the player is so compulsive that once we show him aggression, he folds, and he does fold 95% of the time, which stands to reason, because that's about how often he's going to have a hand he can continue with about 5% of the time. And in those scenarios, having something like a backdoor spade draw or flush draw, or the ability to hit, this happened last night playing against him, where he had raised and I was in the cutoff and he was under the gun +2, so I guess the low jack. And I had like 5-4 suited. I decided to call it from the cutoff. Players behind me were very weak. I think the small blind was even missing this hand, so it's just me and him, and the flop comes off very similar to this. I think it was ace queen 4, and I did have a backdoor draw with the 5-4, and he bet, and I decided to raise, and he did have a hand where he could continue 5% of the time, but again, not the most aggressive player, so he just calls, and the turn comes off, and it's a 4. So now I've just hit trips, and he checked, and I bet for value, and he called, and the river came off, and we were at a less than 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio. He checked, I bet half my stack, and he actually jammed on me, and of course I snap called, and he rolled over ace king. Just so happened to have one of the two hands that could play this way. He probably shouldn't do it without ace queen top 2 pair, but it just shows that that's a 5% of the time where he could actually continue when I took this action against him. And in this particular instance, I did have an escape hatch with trip 4s.
Sporadically bluffs, but solver's mostly raising with the best hands and draws. Well, actually, I say draws, but it's actually not raising a ton of draws. Maybe I'm actually slightly off on this. Solver is raising some draws, but it's also calling with a lot of draws too. Like, notice here, all the flush draws are opting to call. So it's kind of interesting. It's actually using like bottom pair as a draw, which I suppose makes sense. If you raise a hand like 6-5 and then you get re-raised, you can easily fold, right? But if you raise a hand like a flush draw and get re-raised, it's a pretty nasty spot. So if you have a draw that you don't want to get blown off on based on the stack depth, you should not raise with that hand and instead find hands to raise that you don't mind getting blown off of. I imagine this has to do, or has to be the case when you're 40 big blinds deep specifically, or shorter. You have to be a little bit less inclined to raise with draws that have draws that have equity but don't really want to get re-raised. But that's probably why it's raising stuff like king 10 sometimes, right? Stuff like king 7 suited probably just has to be good enough to get in if you have the spades, unfortunately. Fortunately, depending on how much you like to gamble. This is an interesting spot, right? And solver does call significantly more often in position than out of position.
Interesting stuff, but like it gets less complicated when you're at like 60 plus blinds, but at 40 blinds, you know, if somebody leads and you raise and then they re-raise you, like you said, you either want a hand you can get rid of quickly, like something like, just a gut shot, king 10 with no spade. But hands like the king 7 suited with, the 2 spades, you probably don't mind getting it in, because at that point in the tournament, getting it in versus one pair and hitting your spade draw, brings you up to 80 blinds, and you're going to go much further. So kind of depends on the player, kind of depends on the action, kind of depends on your stack. But I think generally this is the strategy you would be taking in this scenario. And it's interesting to me, because the first time I went through this about a year ago, I saw this section, and I remember very clearly, it came to me while we were watching it, that all the hands that I'm check raising, it seems very elementary, the 2 pairs, the 3 of a kinds, things like that, and the best draws just kind of fit. So it was one of those things that I knew how to do, but I didn't know why I was doing it. And then, raising with hands in position like bottom pair and the spade draw, just kind of makes sense because of the amount of folds that we get in position. So interesting that I knew it, but didn't know why I knew it. When you're facing a bet from under the gun +1 on this flop, and how should you play ace jack, jack 5, and 5-5? Well, we just said you should be raising with these hands. Big bet from under the gun +1. It doesn't tell you our position. When you're facing a big bet from under the gun +1, you should raise with these hands. These are your premium hands. You want to get all the money in. Yeah. You should raise with these hands, even though you already have a large equity disadvantage. You still want to develop a raising range with your premium hands and draws. So these are your premiums: top 2 pair, middle 2 pair, and bottom set. On the ace jack 5, it's better to raise with hands like jack 8 suited than it is to raise with a hand like 4-3 suited. He's saying yes. The solver's saying no. So I'm going to say no, because in the real world, that's what I think, because I do have a gut shot to go on with it. So I'm going to say false. Okay, yeah. Your pair plus flush draws should be played as marginal hands, right? Because they do have showdown value, right? You have the jack in your hand, so you do have showdown value, even though your equity is through the roof. On the bottom one, you don't have any showdown value, so you're much more inclined to raise with this, because if you win it without making a pair, at least, then you're happy. But sometimes jack 8's going to win on its own. When they have king queen and they're just c-betting and you call, and then they go check check turn, and then they check check river, your jack 8's going to win a ton, just versus a hand that didn't improve and really can't bluff you now because of your supposed actual hand. Should you defend more often when you're in position facing a 33 bet, or when you're in the big blind facing a 33 bet on this bet? Okay. So when you're in position, you defend more often. Well, just in position, you're going to defend more, right? Yeah, because you're in position. Out of position, you're going to defend less. That's just a standard rule. All this doesn't matter. This word problem doesn't matter. You should just say, when you're in position or out of position, which are you defending more? In position, because you're in position. All right, we're going to mark this as complete. I want to take a look at how long the next section is. We're going about an hour, and I do want to play some today, so don't exactly know how much longer I want to go here. So a lot of people studying today because his site is working slow. All right, the next example, it's not as long, but I do want to take time with this. So you know what? I'm going to go ahead and call it here. This section's probably going to take us 4 or 5, 4 wake up with me streams to get through, because it is kind of an in-depth topic, because it comes up a lot. But that's fine. I think it's better to take it slowly than try to rush through the whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream here. There's plenty of people on. I'm not going to host anybody. And I'll talk to you guys later. I'm definitely playing today. I'm not sure if it's cash or tournaments. Probably cash, because I think I need a little nap. But yeah, I'll see you guys in a little while. Thanks for coming out.